Marcus stood at the edge of the basketball court, his fingers wrapped around the chain-link fence that separated the players from the spectators. The afternoon sun beat down on the concrete as the sound of sneakers, squeaking, and the ball bouncing echoed through the neighborhood park. He watched the game unfold before him, his eyes tracking every pass, every shot, every defensive move. This was where he spent most of his time after school, always watching, never playing. The guys on the court were good, really good. They moved with a confidence Marcus could only dream of having. There was Deshaun, who could sink three-pointers like it was nothing. There was Carlos, whose crossover dribble left defenders stumbling. And then there was Jamal, the unofficial leader of the group, whose presence commanded respect from everyone who stepped onto that court. Marcus had been coming to this park for 2 years now, ever since his family moved to the neighborhood. At first, he told himself he was just observing, learning the game by watching. But deep down, he knew the truth. He was afraid. Afraid of being laughed at, afraid of not being good enough, afraid of confirmation that he didn't belong. His younger sister Maya sometimes asked him why he never played. She was only 10 but seemed to understand people better than most adults. Marcus would shrug and say something about liking to watch the strategy of the game, about learning techniques. But Maya would just shake her head with that knowing look that made him feel transparent. At home, Marcus was a different person. He had a hoop mounted on the garage door, and late at night, when no one was watching, he would practice. He'd worked on his shooting form by watching countless videos online. He'd practiced ball handling until his hands were sore. In the privacy of his driveway, under the dim glow of the porch light, Marcus was actually pretty decent, but that didn't matter. The driveway wasn't the court. The driveway didn't have an audience. The driveway didn't have the risk of public failure. His parents didn't understand. His father, a successful accountant, had never been into sports. His mother was supportive, but didn't push. They were happy Marcus stayed out of trouble, got good grades, and seemed content. They didn't see the longing in his eyes when he watched those games. They didn't notice how he tensed up whenever someone invited him to play. One Saturday afternoon, something different happened. Marcus was at his usual spot by the fence when an older man approached. The man looked to be in his 60s, with graying hair and a weathered face that suggested he'd seen a lot of life. He wore simple clothes, jeans, and a faded t-shirt. But there was something about the way he carried himself that caught Marcus's attention. The man stood beside Marcus for a few minutes, saying nothing, just watching the game. Then, without looking at Marcus, he spoke in a voice that was surprisingly gentle. He said it was interesting how some people spent their whole lives watching others live, their dreams instead of chasing their own. Marcus felt his face flush. It was as if this stranger had read his thoughts, had seen right through him. Marcus wanted to defend himself, to explain that he was just taking his time, that he was planning to join eventually. But the words stuck in his throat. The man continued speaking, sharing that he used to be the same way, always on the sidelines, always with excuses. Then he rolled up his sleeve. On his forearm was a tattoo. It wasn't elaborate or colorful. It was simple black ink forming 3 words. Fear is temporary. Below, it was a date. The man explained that the date marked the day he stopped letting fear control his decisions. He was 35 years old when he got that tattoo, and he'd wished he'd done it 20 years earlier. Marcus stared at the tattoo, something stirring inside him. The man told him that fear feels permanent when you're in it, like a wall you can't climb over. But it's actually the most temporary thing in the world. It only lasts as long as you feed it. The moment you step through it, it disappears like smoke. The man didn't push or lecture. He simply shared his story. He talked about opportunities he'd missed, relationships he'd avoided, experiences he'd denied himself, all because he was afraid of what might happen. He talked about the regret that came from all those years of playing it safe, years he could never get back. Then he said something that hit Marcus hard. He said the people on that court, the ones who seemed so confident and fearless, they felt fear too. Everyone did. The difference was, they'd learned that playing and failing was better than never playing at all. At least when you failed, you learned something. When you watched from the sidelines, you learned nothing except how to be a better spectator. Marcus asked the man why he was telling him this. The old man smiled and said he recognized the look in Marcus's eyes because he'd seen it in the mirror for too many years. He said he wasn't trying to force Marcus to do anything, just wanted to plant a seed. Sometimes people need permission to be brave, need someone to tell them it's okay to try and fail. After the man left, Marcus stayed by the fence, but his mind was racing. He thought about all the afternoons he'd spent watching, all the times he'd invented excuses when someone invited him to play. He thought about his late-night practice sessions in the driveway and how good it felt to make a shot when no one was watching. He wondered what it would feel like to make that same shot with people around. The game on the court ended, and the players started leaving. Jamal noticed Marcus standing there and called out, asking if he wanted to run a few games next Saturday. They needed an extra player. Marcus opened his mouth, the automatic excuse ready to tumble out, but then he remembered the tattoo. Fear is temporary, he heard himself say maybe, which wasn't a yes but wasn't his usual no either. Jamal nodded, seeming satisfied with that answer, and walked off with his friends. Marcus stood there for a long time after everyone left, staring at the empty court as the sun began to set. That night, Marcus couldn't sleep. He kept thinking about the man's tattoo, about the simplicity of those 3 words and how much weight they carried. He thought about what his life might look like in 20 years if he kept watching from the sidelines. The image wasn't pretty. He saw himself older, maybe successful in some ways, but always wondering what if, always regretting the chances he didn't take. He got out of bed and went to his computer. He started researching, reading about fear and courage, about people who'd overcome their anxieties to do remarkable things. He learned that courage wasn't the absence of fear, but action in spite of it. He read stories of people who'd failed publicly, spectacularly even, and survived. More than survived, they'd grown stronger. By the time the sun came up, Marcus had made a decision. He didn't know if he'd actually go through with it, but he'd made the decision, and that felt like something. He went downstairs where his father was making coffee. His dad asked if he was okay, noting the determined look on Marcus's face. Marcus told his father about the man at the park, about the tattoo, about Jamal's invitation. His father listened carefully, then shared something Marcus had never known. He talked about his own regrets, about dreams he'd abandoned because they seemed too risky or impractical. He said he loved his life, loved his family, but sometimes wondered about the roads not taken. His father told him that Marcus had a choice to make, not just about basketball, but about how he wanted to live his life. Would he be someone who took chances, who risked failure for the possibility of success? Or would he be someone who played it safe, who always wondered what might have been? Neither choice was wrong, his father said, but one of them led to far fewer regrets. The week passed slowly. Marcus continued his late-night practice sessions, but now they felt different. They weren't just idle exercise anymore. They were preparation. He was training for something real, something that terrified him but also excited him in a way he'd never felt before. Marcus found himself thinking about that tattoo constantly. Fear is temporary. He repeated it like a mantra, especially when doubt crept in. And doubt did creep in constantly. What if he embarrassed himself? What if he was terrible? What if they laughed at him? But then he'd remember the old man's words. Those fears felt huge now, but they'd be gone the moment he stepped onto that court. They were temporary. The regret of not trying would be permanent. Friday night arrived, and Marcus barely ate dinner. Maya noticed his nervousness and squeezed his hand under the table. She whispered that she thought he was brave, which almost made him tear up. His mother asked what was happening tomorrow, and Marcus, surprising himself, told her the truth. He said he was going to play basketball at the park, his first real game with other people. His mother's face lit up with pride. She didn't make a big deal of it, didn't offer unwanted advice or embarrassing encouragement. She simply said she was proud of him for trying something new, for pushing himself. His father nodded in agreement. And Marcus felt a wave of gratitude for his family's quiet support. That night, Marcus dreamed about the court. In his dream, he was playing, moving with confidence he didn't have in real life. The ball felt natural in his hands. His shots fell smoothly through the net. People cheered. But then the dream shifted, and he was back at the fence, watching someone else live out his dream. He woke up with his heart pounding, knowing which version of himself he wanted to be. Saturday morning arrived with brilliant sunshine and a knot of anxiety in Marcus's stomach. He dressed carefully, putting on his newest basketball shoes and the jersey he'd bought months ago, but never worn outside the house. Looking at himself in the mirror, he barely recognized the person staring back. This person looked ready to play. Now he just had to convince his body to follow through. The walk to the park felt both too long and too short. Every step brought him closer to the moment he'd been avoiding for 2 years. Marcus's hands were sweating, and he wiped them on his shorts repeatedly. He tried to remember everything he'd practiced, all the moves he'd perfected in his driveway, but his mind felt blank with nervousness. When the park came into view, Marcus saw the court was already filling up with players. Some were warming up, taking practice shots. Others stood in groups, talking and laughing. The casual confidence they displayed made Marcus's chest tighten. Maybe this was a mistake. Maybe he should just watch today and play next week, or the week after that. But then he remembered the old man's tattoo. Fear is temporary. The words had been running through his mind all week like a song he couldn't stop hearing. Marcus took a deep breath and forced his feet to keep moving forward. He was done watching. Today, he was going to play. Jamal spotted him approaching and waved him over with a welcoming grin. He introduced Marcus to the others who'd be playing, a mix of regulars and a few guys Marcus hadn't seen before. They seemed friendly enough, but Marcus could barely hear their names over the sound of his own heartbeat pounding in his ears. The game started, and Marcus found himself on Jamal's team. For the first few minutes, he mostly stood in position, trying to remember the basic rules of where he should be. When someone passed him the ball, he panicked and immediately passed it to someone else without even looking at the basket. His teammates didn't say anything negative, but he could feel their confusion. Why was this guy even on the court if he was too scared to shoot? During a break in play, Carlos came over and asked Marcus if he was okay. Marcus wanted to lie, to make up some excuse about being rusty or having an off day. Instead, something made him tell the truth. He admitted this was his first real game, that he'd been watching from the fence for 2 years because he was too afraid to play. He expected Carlos to laugh or roll his eyes, but instead, the older player just nodded with understanding. Carlos shared that everyone starts somewhere, and being scared is part of the process. He pointed out that Marcus had already done the hardest part by showing up. Now he just needed to let himself actually play, instead of overthinking everything. Carlos suggested Marcus stop treating the ball like it was on fire and just take a shot next time he had an opening. What was the worst that could happen? He'd miss. Everyone missed sometimes. The game resumed, and Marcus tried to take Carlos's advice to heart. When he got the ball again, instead of immediately passing, he held it for a moment. His defender backed off slightly, giving him space. This was his chance. Marcus bent his knees, remembered his form from all those late-night practice sessions, and shot. The ball felt good leaving his hands. It arced through the air in what seemed like slow motion, and then it bounced off the rim, missing completely. Marcus felt his face burn with embarrassment, but then something unexpected happened. Jamal called out that it was a good look, encouraging him to keep shooting. Another teammate said his form was solid, just needed to adjust his aim a little. They weren't mocking him. They weren't angry he'd missed. They were treating it like a normal part of the game, which Marcus realized it was. He'd spent so long building this moment up in his mind, imagining catastrophic failure, that he'd forgotten basketball was just a game. People missed shots all the time. Over the next few possessions, Marcus started to relax, but only slightly. He touched the ball a few more times, made a couple of passes that actually helped his team. He even grabbed a rebound, though he fumbled it a bit before securing it. Small victories, but they were victories nonetheless. Then came a moment that changed everything. Marcus's team was down by 2 points with just a minute left. The ball swung around the perimeter, and suddenly Marcus found himself wide open at the three-point line. His teammate passed him the ball, and time seemed to slow down again. This was a big moment. The kind of shot that mattered. Every instinct told Marcus to pass the ball to someone better, someone more experienced. But then he thought about the old man, about the tattoo, about all the years he'd wasted standing at that fence. He thought about his father's words about roads not taken and regrets that lasted forever. And he shot the ball. The moment it left his hands, Marcus knew it felt different from his first attempt. This one felt pure, felt right. The ball sailed through the air, spinning perfectly, and swished through the net without even touching the rim. Nothing but net. His teammates erupted in celebration, rushing over to congratulate him. Marcus stood there, stunned, barely able to process what had just happened. The opposing team inbounded the ball, and the game continued, but Marcus was floating on air. He'd made a three-pointer in a real game, in a moment that mattered. All those nights in the driveway had paid off. More importantly, he'd faced his fear and come out the other side. The old man was right. The fear had been temporary. This feeling, this moment, this was real. His team ended up losing by 1 point, but nobody seemed to care much. After the game, several players came up to Marcus, complimenting his shot and asking why they'd never seen him play before. Marcus didn't have a good answer to that question, so he just shrugged and said he was done watching from the sidelines. Jamal invited Marcus to come back next Saturday. This time Marcus didn't hesitate. He said yes immediately, already looking forward to it. As the group dispersed, Carlos pulled Marcus aside and told him something important. He said Marcus had taken a big step today, but the real test would be coming back after a bad game. Because eventually Marcus would have a terrible game where nothing went right. And that's when he'd find out what he was really made of. Marcus appreciated the honesty. He knew Carlos was right. Today had been a good day, a confidence-building day, but there would be days when he played poorly, when he let his team down, when he embarrassed himself. The question was whether he'd let those bad days send him back to the fence or whether he'd keep pushing through. Walking home, Marcus felt like a different person. His legs were tired, his jersey was soaked with sweat, and he had a scratch on his arm from diving for a loose ball. But he felt alive in a way he never had before. He'd spent 2 years watching other people play. 2 years convincing himself he wasn't good enough. 2 years feeding his fear. Now he knew what he'd been missing. When he got home, Maya was waiting on the porch. She took one look at him and started jumping up and down with excitement, asking him how it went. Marcus couldn't help but smile as he told her about the game, about his shot, about how terrified he'd been and how worth it all had been. His parents came out to listen, and Marcus found himself talking more than he had in months, the words spilling out of him that evening. Marcus sat in his room thinking about the day. He pulled out his phone and looked up tattoo shops in the area. He wasn't sure if he'd actually go through with it. Wasn't even sure if his parents would allow it since he was only 17. But he wanted to mark this moment somehow, wanted a reminder of the day he stopped being a spectator in his own life. He sketched out a design in his notebook. Not exactly like the old man's tattoo, but similar. Something simple, but meaningful. Something that would remind him, on hard days and doubtful days, that he'd already proven he could face his fears. That he'd already taken the hardest step. Over the next few weeks, Marcus played every Saturday. Some games went well, others didn't. There was one particularly brutal afternoon where he couldn't hit a shot to save his life and made several costly turnovers. He felt the old anxiety creeping back, the voice in his head telling him he didn't belong, that he should quit while he was ahead. But he remembered Carlos's words about showing up after a bad game. The following Saturday, Marcus went back to the court. His hands were shaking again, the nervousness returning, but he played anyway. And the Saturday after that, and the one after that. Slowly, gradually, the fear became smaller. It never disappeared completely, but it no longer controlled him. He'd learned that fear was just a feeling, not a fact. It could scream at him all it wanted, but it couldn't stop him unless he let it. Marcus also started branching out in other areas of his life. He joined the school's debate team, something he'd always wanted to do but had been too nervous to try. He asked out a girl he'd liked for months, and while she said no, he survived the rejection just fine. Each new experience reinforced the lesson the old man had taught him. Fear was temporary. Regret was permanent. Better to try and fail than never try at all. One afternoon, about 2 months after his first game, Marcus was at the park when he saw the old man again. The man was sitting on a bench, watching the games with a peaceful expression. Marcus walked over and sat beside him, and for a moment neither of them spoke. Then Marcus rolled up his own sleeve. There, on his forearm, was fresh ink still healing. The tattoo read, "Fear is temporary." Below it was a date, the date of his first game. The old man looked at it and nodded with approval, a smile spreading across his weathered face. The man said he was proud of Marcus, that it took courage to take that first step, and even more courage to keep taking steps after that. He asked how the games had been going, and Marcus told him honestly. Some good, some bad, but all of them worth it. Every single one had taught him something, not just about basketball, but about himself. The old man introduced himself properly this time. His name was Robert, though everyone called him Bobby. He'd been coming to this park for 40 years. First, as a player, then as a coach, and now as someone who just enjoyed watching the game and occasionally offering wisdom to those who needed it. He told Marcus that he'd been hoping to see him on the court someday, that he'd noticed him standing at that fence for months. Before deciding to say something, Marcus asked Bobby why he'd chosen to approach him that particular day. Bobby explained that he'd seen something shift in Marcus's expression that afternoon, a kind of desperation mixed with longing. He recognized it because he'd felt it himself decades ago. Sometimes people need a push, Bobby said, but they have to be ready for it. That day, Marcus had looked ready, even if he didn't know it himself. They talked for over an hour that afternoon. Bobby shared more of his story, the full version this time. He'd spent his youth paralyzed by anxiety and fear of judgment. He'd turned down college scholarships because he was afraid of leaving home. He'd watched the woman he loved marry someone else because he was too scared to tell her how he felt. He'd stayed in a job he hated for 15 years because change seemed too risky. It wasn't until his 35th birthday, sitting alone in his apartment, that Bobby realized he'd wasted half his life. That realization hit him like a truck. He'd been so busy protecting himself from potential pain and failure that he'd forgotten to actually live. The next day, he walked into a tattoo parlor and got the reminder he'd carry forever. Fear is temporary. Bobby told Marcus that the tattoo had been his turning point. Every time he felt that old anxiety creeping in, he'd look at his arm and remember his promise to himself. He went back to school and got his teaching degree. He coached youth basketball for 20 years, helping kids develop not just their skills, but their confidence. He reconnected with old friends he'd lost touch with. He even tracked down the woman he'd loved and apologized for his cowardice, though by then she had a family and a full life. She forgave him, and they became friends, which was more than he deserved. Most importantly, Bobby said, he'd learned to separate feeling afraid from being afraid. Everyone feels fear. It's a human emotion, automatic and unavoidable. But being afraid, letting that fear dictate your choices and limit your life, that's a decision. You can feel the fear and do the thing anyway. That's what courage actually is. Marcus absorbed every word. He told Bobby about his own journey over the past 2 months, about the games he'd played, the debate team he'd joined, the girl who'd rejected him. He admitted that he still felt anxious before every game, still had moments where the old doubts crept in. But now, he had tools to fight back. He had evidence that he could face his fears and survive. Bobby nodded with understanding and shared something crucial. He said Marcus shouldn't expect the fear to disappear completely. That wasn't realistic. Even after decades of pushing through fear, Bobby still felt it sometimes. The difference was that now, it was like background noise rather than a deafening siren. Marcus would get better at managing it, better at recognizing when fear was trying to protect him from real danger versus when it was just trying to keep him small and safe, as their conversation wound down. Bobby mentioned something that caught Marcus off guard. He said that getting the tattoo, facing his fears, changing his life, those things hadn't just affected him. They'd rippled outward, touching everyone around him. His students had learned courage from watching him model it. His friends had been inspired to take their own risks. Even strangers he'd talked to, like Marcus, had been changed by his willingness to share his story. That thought stuck with Marcus as he walked home that evening. He'd been so focused on his own transformation, his own journey, that he hadn't considered how it might affect others. But he thought about Maya, who'd been watching him with such pride. He thought about his parents, who seemed happier and more open since Marcus had started taking risks. He even thought about some of the younger kids at the park who'd started asking him for advice. The following week at school, something unexpected happened. Marcus was sitting in the cafeteria when a freshman named Tyler approached him nervously. Tyler had apparently heard about Marcus from someone on the basketball court. He asked if they could talk, and Marcus agreed, curious about what this was about. Tyler explained that he wanted to try out for the school's basketball team, but he was terrified. He'd never played organized basketball before, just shot around in his backyard. He was worried about embarrassing himself, about not being good enough, about confirming all his worst fears about himself. The words sounded painfully familiar to Marcus. For a moment, Marcus didn't know what to say. He was still figuring things out himself. He was hardly an expert on overcoming fear. But then he realized that was exactly why he could help. He remembered how much Bobby's honesty had meant to him. How powerful it was to hear from someone who understood the struggle. Marcus told Tyler his story. Not a sanitized, heroic version, but the real one. He talked about standing at that fence for 2 years, too scared to play. He talked about his first game, how terrified he'd been, how badly he'd wanted to run away. He showed Tyler his tattoo and explained what it meant. And then he told Tyler the most important thing. The fear would never completely go away, but it would become manageable. It would become smaller than his desire to play. Tyler listened intently. Marcus could see the wheels turning in the younger boy's mind. Tyler asked if Marcus thought he should try out, and Marcus realized this was an important moment. He couldn't make the decision for Tyler. That would defeat the whole purpose. Instead, Marcus asked Tyler what he thought he'd regret more, trying out and failing, or never trying at all. The question seemed to resonate with Tyler. He sat quietly for a moment, then nodded slowly. He said he'd regret not trying. Marcus smiled and told him then he already had his answer. Everything else was just noise, just fear trying to keep him safe, but actually keeping him stuck. Tyler thanked him and left, and Marcus felt something unexpected. He felt like maybe he'd just paid forward the gift Bobby had given him. Over the next several weeks, Marcus noticed a subtle shift in how people saw him. He was no longer the quiet kid who faded into the background. He was becoming someone others came to for advice, for encouragement, for perspective. It was strange and uncomfortable at first, but also deeply fulfilling. He'd spent so long trying to be invisible that he'd forgotten what it felt like to matter, to make a difference in someone else's life. Tyler did try out for the basketball team. He didn't make the varsity squad, but he made junior varsity and was thrilled. He thanked Marcus repeatedly, saying he never would have tried without their conversation. Marcus brushed off the thanks, saying Tyler had done the hard part himself. But privately, Marcus felt proud. He'd helped someone take a step he knew was terrifying. The Saturday games at the park continued to be a central part of Marcus's routine. He'd improved significantly since that first nervous game. He still wasn't the best player, not by a long shot, but he was solid. More importantly, he was consistent. He showed up every week, played hard, learned from his mistakes, and celebrated his successes. The guys at the park had come to respect him, not because he was the most talented, but because he was reliable and gave everything he had. One afternoon, a new kid showed up at the park. He looked about Marcus's age, maybe a little younger. He stood by the fence watching the games with an expression Marcus recognized immediately. It was the same look he'd worn for 2 years, that mixture of longing and fear, wanting something but being too scared to reach for it. Marcus finished his game and walked over to the kid. He introduced himself and asked if the kid wanted to play. The kid, whose name was David, immediately started making excuses. He wasn't very good. He didn't know anyone. He didn't want to slow down the game. Maybe next time. Marcus smiled because he'd said all those exact words before, instead of pushing. Marcus just stood there with David for a while, watching the next game. Then, after a comfortable silence, Marcus started talking. He told David about his own experience, about the fence, about Bobby, about the tattoo. He didn't try to convince David to play. He just shared his story and let David draw his own conclusions. David listened, but didn't say much. When the game ended, Marcus asked if he was coming back next week. David said maybe, which Marcus recognized as the same maybe he'd given Jamal months ago. Marcus nodded and told David he hoped to see him on the court, not by the fence. Then he left, giving David space to think. The following Saturday, Marcus arrived at the park early. He was warming up when he saw David walking toward the court, not the fence. David looked terrified, his hands shaking as he approached. But he was approaching. Marcus caught his eye and nodded in acknowledgement. Then he passed David the ball for a warm-up shot. David's first shot was an air ball, missing everything. Marcus could see the embarrassment on his face, could see him preparing to make an excuse and leave. But Marcus just rebounded the ball and passed it back to him, telling him to try again, and again, and again. Each shot got a little better, and slowly, gradually, David started to relax. When teams were chosen for the game, Marcus made sure David was on his team. During the game, Marcus looked for opportunities to pass to David to help build his confidence. David was rough around the edges, clearly inexperienced, but he was trying. That's all that mattered. Marcus remembered how much those early encouragements from Jamal and Carlos had meant to him. Now he had the chance to do the same for someone else. After the game, David thanked Marcus profusely. He said he almost didn't come, almost talked himself out of it, but he'd kept thinking about Marcus's story. If Marcus could face his fear, David figured he could too. Marcus told him the hardest part was over. David had shown up. Now he just needed to keep showing up. That evening, Marcus sat with his family at dinner and told them about David. His father commented on how much Marcus had changed over the past few months. Not just in confidence, but in his willingness to help others. Marcus had always been kind, but now he was actively reaching out, actively trying to make a difference. His mother agreed, saying she was proud of the young man Marcus was becoming. Maya, with her usual directness, asked Marcus if he was happy. The question caught him off guard. He'd been so focused on overcoming fear, on taking action, on pushing himself, that he hadn't stopped to consider whether all of it was making him happy. But thinking about it now, he realized the answer was yes. Absolutely yes. He was happier than he'd been in years, maybe ever. Marcus's senior year of high school arrived with new challenges and opportunities. College applications loomed on the horizon, and for the first time, Marcus found himself actually excited about the future instead of anxious about it. The old Marcus would have applied only to local schools, choosing safety over possibility. The new Marcus was looking at colleges across the country, considering programs he'd once thought were out of his reach. His debate team coach pulled him aside one afternoon and suggested he consider competing in the state championship. Marcus's first instinct was to decline, to say he wasn't ready, that other team members deserved the spot more. But then he caught himself. That was old Marcus talking, the one who watched from the fence. New Marcus took a breath, looked at his tattoo, and said yes. Preparing for the state debate championship was brutal. Marcus had to research topics exhaustively, anticipate counter-arguments, and practice speaking with confidence even when he felt uncertain. There were nights he wanted to quit, moments where the pressure felt overwhelming. But he'd learned something important over the past months. Discomfort was temporary. Growth happened in those uncomfortable spaces. The debate tournament was held at a large university 3 hours away. Marcus's parents drove him there, along with Maya, who insisted on coming to support her brother. Walking into the venue, Marcus felt the familiar flutter of anxiety in his chest. Hundreds of students from schools across the state filled the building, all of them looking confident and prepared. Marcus's brain immediately started cataloging reasons why he didn't belong there. Then he saw Bobby. The old man was sitting in the lobby. When their eyes met, Bobby smiled and walked over. Marcus was shocked. He asked what Bobby was doing there, and Bobby explained that Marcus had told him about the tournament weeks ago. Bobby had decided to make the drive to watch. He said he wouldn't miss it for anything. The gesture moved Marcus deeply. He introduced Bobby to his family, and they all chatted for a few minutes before Marcus had to report to his first round. Before leaving, Bobby put a hand on Marcus's shoulder and reminded him that fear was temporary, but courage was permanent. Marcus nodded, feeling his resolve strengthen. The first debate round was terrifying. Marcus's opponent was polished and articulate. barely seeming to breathe between perfectly constructed arguments. Marcus stumbled over his words initially, his prepared notes suddenly feeling inadequate. But halfway through his rebuttal, something clicked. He stopped trying to be perfect and just started being honest. He spoke from the heart, using his research, but also trusting his instincts. The judge's expression shifted from skeptical to interested. Marcus didn't win that first round, but he didn't lose badly either. The judge gave him solid scores and constructive feedback. More importantly, Marcus realized he'd survived. He'd stood up in front of strangers and defended his position, and the world hadn't ended. The fear that had felt so massive beforehand had shrunk to something manageable over the course of the day. Marcus competed in 3 more rounds. He won 2 and lost 2, which put him in the middle of the pack. Not good enough to advance to finals, but respectable for his first major tournament. During the awards ceremony, Marcus sat with his team and felt genuinely content. He'd pushed himself, faced his fears, and learned enormous amounts. That was worth more than any trophy. After the ceremony, Bobby took Marcus and his family out for dinner. Over burgers and fries, they talked about the day. Bobby shared stories about his own moments of facing fear, some successes, and many failures. He emphasized that the outcome mattered less than the fact that Marcus had shown up and competed. That's what separated people who achieved their goals from people who only dreamed about them. Maya asked Bobby something that caught everyone off guard. She wanted to know if he had any regrets about waiting so long to face his fears. Bobby was quiet for a moment, then answered honestly. He said he regretted the lost time, absolutely. But he didn't regret the journey itself, because it made him who he was. If he'd learned those lessons younger, maybe he wouldn't have had the wisdom to truly appreciate them. Maybe he needed to go through all that fear and regret to reach the other side. The answer seemed to satisfy Maya.
Ow.
But it also made Marcus think. He'd been so focused on overcoming his fears that he hadn't considered what those years of watching from the fence had taught him. They'd taught him empathy. They'd taught him patience. They'd taught him to recognize that same struggle in others, which allowed him to help people like Tyler and David. Maybe his journey hadn't been wasted time after all. Maybe it was preparation for something bigger. As senior year progressed, Marcus continued to grow in unexpected ways. He started a mentorship program at school, pairing upperclassmen with freshmen who struggled with confidence and anxiety. The program was his idea, born from his own experiences and his desire to help others avoid the years he'd lost to fear. The school administration loved it, and within months, dozens of students were participating. Through the mentorship program, Marcus met dozens of kids facing their own fears. Some were afraid of social situations. Some were afraid of academic failure. Some were afraid of family expectations. Each story was unique, but the underlying fear was universal. Everyone was afraid of something. Everyone struggled with that voice that said they weren't good enough, didn't belong, should give up before they failed. Marcus shared his story over and over, showing his tattoo, explaining what it meant. He talked about Bobby, about the fence, about that first terrifying game. But he also emphasized that fear itself wasn't the enemy. Fear was just information, the brain's way of saying something matters. The enemy was letting fear make decisions, allowing it to shrink your life down to only the safe and comfortable things. One of his mentees, a girl named Sophie, struggled particularly hard with social anxiety. She was brilliant in class but couldn't bring herself to speak up or participate in group activities. Marcus worked with her for weeks, not pushing, but gently encouraging, sharing strategies that had helped him. He suggested she start small, maybe just asking one question in class per day. Then maybe answering one question. Baby steps, he told her, were still steps forward. Months later, Sophie performed a solo in the school's spring concert. Marcus sat in the audience with tears in his eyes as he watched her sing, her voice clear and strong despite the trembling he could see in her hands. After the performance, Sophie found Marcus and hugged him tightly. She said she'd been thinking about his tattoo the whole time she was on stage. Fear is temporary. The moment had passed, and she'd done it. College acceptance letters started arriving in the spring. Marcus had applied to a mix of schools, some nearby and some far away, some prestigious and some practical. When the envelope from his dream school arrived, he held it for a long time before opening it. This was a school he never would have considered applying to a year ago. It seemed too good for him, too far from home, too risky. He opened the letter with his family gathered around, accepted full scholarship. They wanted him in their honors program. His parents erupted in celebration, and Maya tackled him with a hug. Marcus felt overwhelmed with emotion, not just happiness, but also a profound sense of validation. He'd taken a chance on himself, and it had paid off in ways he never could have imagined. That Saturday at the park, Marcus played basketball with a lightness he'd never felt before. Between games, he sat with Bobby and told him about the college acceptance. Bobby's pride was evident in his smile. He said he'd known from the moment he saw Marcus at that fence that the kid had potential. He just needed someone to give him permission to believe in himself. Marcus thanked Bobby for everything he'd done, for approaching him that day, for sharing his story, for continuing to show up and support him. Bobby waved off the thanks with characteristic humility. He said Marcus had done all the hard work himself. Bobby had just planted a seed. Marcus was the one who'd watered it and made it grow. As graduation approached, Marcus was asked to give a speech at the senior assembly. Standing at that podium, looking out at hundreds of his classmates, Marcus felt a familiar flutter of nerves. But now he knew what to do with that feeling. He acknowledged it, thanked it for reminding him this moment mattered, and then he spoke from the heart. He told his story. Not the sanitized version, but the real one. He talked about standing at the fence for 2 years, paralyzed by fear. He talked about Bobby and the tattoo. He talked about that first game, about failure and embarrassment and pushing through anyway. He showed them his tattoo and explained what those 3 words had taught him. Fear is temporary. The things you don't do, the chances you don't take, those regrets last forever. The speech resonated deeply with the audience. After the assembly, dozens of students approached Marcus to share their own fears and anxieties. Some cried, some laughed. All of them seemed to find comfort in knowing they weren't alone, that even people who seemed confident struggled with the same doubts and worries. Marcus listened to each person, offered what encouragement he could, and felt grateful for his journey. On graduation day, Marcus wore his cap and gown with pride. As he walked across the stage to receive his diploma, he saw his family cheering in the stands. He saw Bobby, who'd become like a grandfather to him, standing and applauding. He saw Tyler and David and Sophie and all the other people he'd helped along the way. He saw his debate coach and his mentees and his teammates from the park. He realized he'd built a community, not through being perfect or fearless, but through being honest about his struggles and brave enough to keep trying. After the ceremony, Marcus found Bobby in the crowd. They stood together for a moment, watching the celebration unfold around them. Bobby told Marcus he was proud of him, not just for graduating or getting into a great college, but for becoming the kind of person who helps others face their fears. That was the real legacy, Bobby said. Not what you achieve, but who you help along the way. Marcus asked Bobby what he was going to do now that Marcus was leaving for college. Bobby laughed and said the same thing he'd always done. Come to the park, watch the games, and keep an eye out for kids standing at the fence. There were always more people who needed someone to tell them it was okay to be scared and brave at the same time. The summer before college, Marcus continued going to the park every Saturday. He played basketball, but he also started doing what Bobby had done for him. He watched for kids at the fence, the ones with that look of longing mixed with fear. He'd approach them casually, strike up conversations, and sometimes, when the moment felt right, he'd tell them about the tattoo and what it meant. Some listened and walked away. Others listened and stepped onto the court. Marcus didn't keep score or track success rates. He just kept showing up, kept sharing his story, kept offering the same gift Bobby had given him. The gift of knowing that fear was temporary, but courage could change everything. On his last Saturday before leaving for college, Marcus played one final game at the park. All his regular teammates were there, along with Tyler and David and several other kids he'd helped over the past year. Bobby sat on his usual bench, watching with that peaceful smile. When the game ended, everyone gathered around Marcus for a group photo. Looking at all these faces, people who'd become his friends and his community, Marcus felt overwhelmed with gratitude. A year ago, he'd been standing at that fence, convinced he didn't belong, certain that fear would always control him. Now, he was leaving for college as someone completely different. Not because he'd conquered fear, but because he'd learned to live alongside it. Before leaving the park that day, Marcus walked over to the fence one last time. He stood where he'd stood for 2 years, but now instead of watching others play, he was saying goodbye to them. The perspective had completely flipped. He wasn't on the outside looking in anymore. He was part of the game, part of the community, part of something bigger than his own fear. Bobby joined him at the fence. They stood in comfortable silence for a moment. Then Bobby put his arm around Marcus's shoulder. He said that Marcus was ready for whatever came next. College would bring new challenges, new fears, new opportunities to either step forward or step back. But Bobby had no doubt which choice Marcus would make. Marcus looked at his tattoo one more time. The ink had healed completely now, the words permanently etched into his skin. Fear is temporary. 3 simple words that had changed his entire life. He'd carry them with him to college and beyond, a reminder of the day he stopped watching and started living. A reminder that the best moments in life exist on the other side of fear, waiting for anyone brave enough to reach for them.